The land between two rivers, October 539 BCE. The city of Babylon is under attack. The Persians are inside. No one saw them coming. The gates were left open. The soldiers were not ready. The king was partying. The army was asleep. In one night, the most powerful city in the world is taken without a battle. Babylon has fallen. But this story didn't start here. To understand how it all ended, we have to go back to the beginning, the cradle of civilization. The story of Mesopotamia is not one of sudden grandeur, but of slow, deliberate progress. Long before cities and kings rose, there were rivers, two massive rivers, the Tigris to the east and the Euphrates to the west. These rivers, though a natural part of the landscape, were the life force that defined the very land itself. To those who lived here, the rivers were more than just sources of water. They were lifelines, veins running through the heart of an otherwise arid and harsh region. The Fertile Crescent that lay between these rivers, stretching from the Persian Gulf in the south to modern-day Syria and Turkey, became a thriving land of agriculture. However, this wasn't a land of ready-made bounty. The rivers flooded unpredictably, often drowning crops and causing devastation. The ancient people here learned to adapt. Over centuries, they created intricate irrigation systems to tame the rivers, carving out a life from the land. Canals were dug and ditches were built, drawing water from the rivers to the farthest reaches of their fields. This labor-intensive process allowed them to harness the river's seasonal floods, turning the land into one of the most fertile places on Earth. Survival here demanded cooperation. Unlike the north, where farming was more about herding and where communities were scattered and independent, Mesopotamia's rivers bound people together. When the floodwaters came, communities worked side by side, digging ditches and constructing barriers. This early form of collective labor laid the foundations for what would soon become a network of cities. With water came food, and with food came growth, both of populations and of ideas. Life began to stabilize. More people lived in one place. With time, the land didn't just feed them, it gave them something else, meaning. They built permanent homes from sun-baked clay and began to settle in clusters along the riverbanks. No longer were they wandering nomads. They were becoming something more. They were becoming the first urban societies in human history. This fertile region, today known as the Fertile Crescent, became a birthplace for civilization itself. As early as 3500 BCE, the area between the rivers was teeming with activity. The promise of this land was clear. The rivers were not just flowing with water, but with potential. The first cities and the rise of culture. Among the first to grasp the promise of the rivers were the people of Eridu. According to Sumerian tradition, Eridu was the first city ever built. It sat near the ancient coastline of the Persian Gulf, though the land around it would change over time. What made Eridu special wasn't just its location, but its focus on religion. At the very heart of the city stood a temple, simple at first, but growing larger with each passing generation. The temple was not just a place of worship, it was the center of the city's life, a place of community, politics, and spiritual purpose. The people who settled here believed that their very survival depended on appeasing the gods. The rivers could be kind, but they could also be cruel. And so, the people of Eridu, like those in other early cities, worshipped not just for religious reasons, but for survival. The gods controlled the flow of water. The gods controlled the fertility of the land. The gods controlled everything. So they built temples. They offered sacrifices. They kept careful records of omens and dreams. They entrusted the priests with the task of ensuring divine favor. As time passed, the role of the priest began to expand. These priests didn't just interpret divine will. They took on more responsibilities. They controlled land and labor. They decided when to plant and when to harvest. They supervised the irrigation works. As the priesthood grew in power, so too did the cities they controlled. Soon, other cities followed in Eridu's footsteps: Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Nippur. Each city was dedicated to its own god, with a temple at its heart. These cities were no longer just settlements. They were complex, growing communities with vast networks of trade and politics. The people of Uruk, for example, turned their city into the largest urban center in the world by 3000 BCE. The city swelled with people, and the need for organization became ever more pressing. From humble beginnings, the role of the king started to emerge. Kings in Uruk weren't just military leaders, they were part of the religious structure. They were appointed by the gods to protect and govern the people, ensuring the well-being of both the city and the divine order. These cities were where innovation took root. To manage growing populations, trade became essential. People exchanged goods, including grain, wool, and dates, with other cities. This trade expanded beyond Mesopotamia itself. Goods were traded into Iran, the Levant, and even the Indus Valley. With trade came contact, and with contact came ideas. The potter's wheel was invented. Builders learned to stack bricks higher. Craftsmen began working with metal. Tools were sharpened, and productivity increased. It was in these cities and in the hearts of these temples that the foundation of civilization was laid. The Sumerians began developing systems of writing to manage trade, keep records, and track ownership. The first cuneiform symbols were simple. A picture of a fish meant fish. A loaf meant bread. Over time, these pictographs became more sophisticated, evolving into a complex writing system. Cuneiform allowed for communication over distances and time. For the first time, people could write down their laws, keep records of trade, and pass on knowledge. The invention of writing was a revolution. It allowed ideas to be transmitted across generations. It allowed people to track history, to understand their past, and to write their future. It became not just a tool for accounting, but a means to shape civilization itself. Kingship, labor, and the making of civilization. As the cities of Mesopotamia grew, so did the complexity of their governments. The role of the king began to shift. Early kings had been primarily military leaders, appointed by the gods to defend their people. But as cities became larger and more intricate, the role of the king evolved. Kings were no longer just warriors, they were rulers. They oversaw the daily operations of their city and governed the people through both force and law. With the advent of kingship came the need for order. Cities like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash needed leaders who could manage both the practical and spiritual aspects of their societies. The priests were still powerful, but their influence was increasingly shared with the kings. The king's role was now multifaceted. He was a protector, a judge, a military commander, and an administrator. His task was not only to lead his people in battle, but also to ensure that the gods were appeased and that the city's infrastructure, its canals, temples, and walls, was maintained. The economy was becoming more structured as well. The labor force was divided. Farmers worked the fields, craftsmen produced goods, and scribes kept records. Labor was often used as a form of tax. People paid taxes in the form of goods, like grain or livestock, or by contributing their time to public works projects. Taxes were collected by the priests or the king's representatives and stored in the city's granaries. Social hierarchy became deeply ingrained. At the top were the kings, priests, and wealthy landowners. Below them were the traders, craftsmen, and farmers. At the bottom were the slaves, those who had been captured in war or born into servitude. Social mobility was rare, and power was passed down through the generations. Kingship was often hereditary, and the son of a king would inherit his father's throne. However, despite the rigid class system, life under kingship was not just one of rigid control. It was a world of innovation and creativity. New technologies spread across the land. The wheel was perfected, metalworking advanced. People studied the stars, learning to track seasons and predict floods. Cities grew in size and complexity, and trade routes spread across Mesopotamia, connecting the cities to each other and to the world beyond. As kings ruled over these growing cities, their power began to be immortalized. Monuments were built, temples were constructed, and the king's names were inscribed in stone and clay. To have one's name written down was a sign of eternal power. The written word was a weapon and a legacy. The birth of civilization. The land between the rivers was not just a cradle of agriculture. It was the cradle of civilization itself. Over thousands of years, people transformed the wild, unpredictable land into a flourishing society. They built cities, they created laws, they invented writing, they developed systems of trade and administration. But what truly made Mesopotamia special was not just the physical infrastructure. It was the collective mindset that arose here. The belief that through cooperation, labor, and governance, people could build something that would last beyond their lifetimes. The ancient cities of Mesopotamia were not simply places where people lived. They were the first true cities of human civilization. And it all began with the rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates carved their way through the land, leaving behind fertile soil and the potential for something greater. The people who lived there seized that potential and shaped it into one of the first organized societies the world has ever seen. In this fertile crescent, people stopped wandering and started building. They built cities, they built systems, and they built a legacy that would last millennia. Through their innovations, their labor, and their faith, the people of Mesopotamia became the first to create civilization. It was not just a land between rivers. It was the beginning of everything. The rise of Uruk, first cities and first kings, foundations of power, the city of Uruk. Before kings, there were cities, and the first of them, truly vast, truly structured, was Uruk. Located along the Euphrates River in what is now southern Iraq, Uruk wasn't just a cluster of homes or farms. It was a planned, functioning city with canals, walls, temples, and quarters that served the needs of tens of thousands. By 3500 BCE, it had grown into a political and religious hub, unlike anything the world had seen. The people of Uruk built more than homes. They built a system. This system relied on centralized control, specialized labor, and hierarchy. Farmers grew food, which was stored in temple warehouses. Craftsmen made tools and ceramics. Priests organized offerings and oversaw the calendar. Rulers kept records. Everyone had a role, and the city worked, because the city was led. At the heart of Uruk stood a series of temple complexes that dominated the skyline. The most famous was dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love, war, and fertility. This wasn't just a place for worship. It was the administrative and spiritual engine of the city. Here, priests tracked supplies, approved rituals, and issued commands. The temple was power, and power was rooted in the divine. Uruk's population surged because it gave people something they'd never had: structure and belonging within a large urban society. This structure made it possible to support kingship, not as a vague concept, but as a working institution. The city became more than a place to live. It became a body with a brain, a will, and a face. And eventually, that face belonged to a man who would become legend: Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, legend, memory, and rule. He may have been real, he definitely became a myth. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, lived, according to later Sumerian king lists, sometime around 2700 BCE, but it was the epic written centuries later that gave him immortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells of a restless king who sought greatness, defied the gods, lost his closest friend, and tried to conquer death itself. It is the oldest epic we know, and one of the clearest early portraits of kingship in human history. In the story, Gilgamesh is powerful but reckless. The people complain of his cruelty and arrogance. The gods respond by sending Enkidu, a wild man raised in the wilderness, to humble him. The two men clash, then become companions. Together, they slay monsters, defy taboos, and push the limits of human ambition. But when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is forced to confront something no king can defeat: mortality. The text is more than a myth. It reveals how kings were seen and how they wanted to be remembered. Gilgamesh was not just a ruler, he was a builder. The prologue of the epic lists the walls of Uruk as his lasting achievement. Look upon his works, it says, count the bricks. This was how kings were measured, not just by war or wealth, but by what they left behind in stone and story. Gilgamesh may not have said all the things written about him. He may not have wrestled gods or found a plant of eternal life. But he ruled in a time when kingship was forming, when the line between divine authority and human governance was beginning to blur. And in that blurred space, kings like him became symbols of both might and memory. They ruled with force, but also with myth. The En and the Lugal, power divided. In the early days of Mesopotamia, power didn't belong to one person, it was split. Between the temple and the palace, the priest and the warrior, these roles had names, En and Lugal. The En was the priest king, the spiritual leader tied directly to the gods, through rituals and divine signs. The Lugal, literally big man, was the war leader, the one who defended the city and enforced decisions. For a while, they coexisted. But over time, the balance shifted. Temples had long been the center of social and economic life. They managed food storage, land ownership, and offerings to the gods. Priests could read omens, interpret dreams, and determine which days were favorable for planting, marrying, or going to war. But as cities grew and threats mounted, the need for military leadership became more pressing. The Lugal became not just a protector, but a ruler. In Uruk and elsewhere, war became more frequent, between cities, over canals, fields, and borderlines. Each city wanted independence. Some even claimed divine favor for their local gods over others. In these struggles, the role of the Lugal expanded. By 2600 BCE, kings were no longer just war leaders. They became lawgivers, builders, and claimants to divine sanction. The palace grew in power. The En faded into ritual roles. Yet the spiritual and administrative authority of the temple never disappeared. Kings still built temples and made offerings. They claimed their right to rule through the gods. This duality between divine guidance and earthly command shaped Mesopotamian kingship for centuries. It created a model where the king was not a god, but close to one, blessed by the gods, entrusted to act in their name. The transition from En to Lugal reflected a bigger shift, from shared authority to centralized rule. It was not peaceful, it was not immediate, but it laid the groundwork for dynasties, conquest, and bureaucracy. And it helped turn cities like Uruk into states. Ur, Lagash, and the fight for supremacy. Cities didn't stay quiet. As kings rose in one place, rivals emerged in others. By 2500 BCE, southern Mesopotamia was a web of independent city-states, each with its own walls, its own god, and its own king. Ur, Lagash, Umma, and others vied for territory and prestige. They fought over fields, canals, and sacred boundaries. And while these wars were local, their impact shaped how power functioned in Mesopotamia. One of the best documented rivalries was between Lagash and Umma. The cities argued over farmland along their shared border. A king of Lagash named Eannatum led a campaign to assert control, defeating Umma's forces and installing a treaty that he claimed was divinely sanctioned. His victory was immortalized in the Stele of the Vultures, a stone monument showing soldiers in phalanx formation and rows of enemy corpses. It was one of the first visual propaganda tools in human history. Meanwhile, Ur continued to rise as a religious and economic powerhouse. Its ziggurat, dedicated to the moon god Nana, became a symbol of civic pride and divine favor. Trade flowed through its port, reaching the Persian Gulf and beyond. Its kings carved their names into temple bricks and boasted of restoring the sacred order. In these cities, power wasn't just about military force. It was about visibility, ritual, and legacy. These rivalries were intense, but they also produced innovation. Kings recorded their victories in inscriptions. Temples documented land ownership and grain yields. Law codes were copied and enforced. As each city tried to outdo its rivals, They built monuments, standardized administration, and expanded the use of writing. Competition fueled growth. The constant tension between cities never fully dissolved. It was a feature, not a flaw, of Mesopotamian civilization. While kings dreamed of unification, most ruled over a few hundred square miles. The dream of empire would come later. For now, cities fought to be first, if not in size, then in memory. The invention of writing, claiming time. It began with numbers, tokens in clay envelopes, marking sheep, grain, and silver. Then came marks, wedges pressed into wet clay, organized by category, evolving into signs. By 3200 BCE, these signs became the world's first written language, cuneiform. It wasn't meant for poetry, it was made for records, for authority, for permanence. And once it began, it never stopped. Writing transformed everything. Kings could now issue commands that traveled beyond their voice. Temples could keep exact accounts of tribute. Land transfers, marriage contracts, and legal cases were inscribed, archived, and referred to. The scribe became essential, not just a recorder, but an interpreter of power. To write was to control not only people, but time itself. Cuneiform began as pictographs, but soon developed into abstract symbols. It required training. Scribes studied for years to memorize signs and learn multiple languages. Their training took place in schools called adubas, where they copied proverbs, contracts, and kingly inscriptions. The system was strict, but it produced literacy among the elite, and with it, continuity. What mattered most to early rulers was being remembered. In a world where cities fell and temples burned, clay tablets survived. A name pressed into clay could outlast the walls it was carved in. Gilgamesh, Ur-Nammu, Eannatum, they understood this. Their stories and laws were not just lived, they were written. Writing made kingship visible. It gave rulers a voice that could whisper through time. And in the end, Mesopotamia's true innovation wasn't just kings, or cities, or temples. It was the ability to leave a trace. To say, I was here. I ruled. I mattered. Sargon the Great and the First Empire, the rise of a servant king. Before the Age of Empires, Mesopotamia was defined by city-states. Each was fiercely independent, focused on its own god, its own king, and its own destiny. The cities were proud, prosperous, and often in conflict with one another. But no single city could rise above the others for long. The idea of one central power ruling from a single capital seemed out of reach. That is, until the rise of Sargon of Akkad, a man who would rewrite the rules of governance and establish the first true empire in history. Sargon's origins are as legendary as his rise. According to Akkadian myth, he was born a servant. As the story goes, he was the child of a high priestess, placed in a reed basket and abandoned by the river. He was discovered by a gardener who raised him in the city of Kish, far removed from any royal privileges. From humble beginnings, Sargon's journey toward greatness wasn't defined by wealth, lineage, or inheritance. It was his extraordinary will and vision that shaped his path. Growing up in a servant's household, Sargon was never bound by the traditions or constraints of nobility. His early years gave him a unique understanding of the world, one where power was earned, not inherited. The political system of the time was defined by powerful city-states like Ur, Uruk, and Lagash. Each ruled by its own king and priesthood. Sargon knew that the system was built on alliances, loyalty, and often brute strength. But he also understood its inherent instability. The city-states, despite their military might, could never truly hold on to power without unity. And unity, Sargon realized, would be his key to success. By 2334 BCE, Sargon had risen to power, first as the cupbearer to the king of Kish, and eventually seizing control after a strategic coup. But his ambitions were not limited to the city of Kish. He was determined to unite the cities of Mesopotamia into a single, cohesive empire. His goal wasn't merely conquest, it was transformation. Instead of simply fighting for land, Sargon sought to create a system of governance that stretched across the entire region, one that would tie these disparate cities together under a common rule. Building the empire: cities, taxes, and control. Sargon's military campaigns were swift and brutal, but his genius lay not just in his ability to conquer, but in his ability to govern. After defeating city after city, most notably Uruk, Ur, and Lagash, Sargon didn't simply loot and pillage, he absorbed them. He allowed the local leaders to remain in power, but only under his authority. In this way, Sargon maintained the loyalty of the cities, while consolidating his own control. One of the most groundbreaking aspects of Sargon's empire was its reliance on local rulers, known as Ensi, who governed individual provinces. These rulers were not autonomous, but were appointed by Sargon and were tasked with ensuring the tribute flowed smoothly from the provinces to the central government. Taxes were not paid in money, as coins did not yet exist. Instead, tribute was collected in the form of grain, livestock, textiles, and labor. These resources helped fuel Akkad's growing influence and allowed the empire to function efficiently. Sargon's empire did not rely on a single capital, but was instead spread across several major cities, the most important of which was Akkad, the city that gave the empire its name. The location of Akkad is still uncertain, but it is believed to have been somewhere near the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The capital served as the political and military heart of the empire, a place where decisions were made, orders were issued, and resources were stored. To help administer his vast empire, Sargon employed a network of messengers and scribes, whose role was to ensure that orders from Akkad were carried out swiftly and effectively. In the cities he conquered, Sargon didn't just stamp out local customs. Instead, he allowed the old ways to continue, but he placed his name above all others. Local gods were still honored, but Sargon made sure his own image was displayed prominently. His name and titles inscribed on monuments and buildings, his power symbolized through art and inscriptions. By adopting a policy of integration rather than destruction, Sargon not only maintained control over the cities he conquered, but also unified them in a way that would have been impossible through force alone. Sargon's empire stretched from the Persian Gulf in the south to northern Akkad. His military campaigns extended into the Levant, and his reach even touched parts of Anatolia. Yet despite his massive territorial gains, Sargon's greatest accomplishment was the creation of a unified administration that could manage such an extensive empire. Roads were built to connect the cities, and trade flourished along these routes. In this way, Sargon turned his military conquests into a lasting legacy. He didn't just capture territory, he reshaped the entire region's political, social, and economic fabric. Religion, propaganda, and the meaning of power. Sargon understood the importance of religion in maintaining control. In a land where gods were believed to hold dominion over all aspects of life, the king's relationship with the divine was paramount. Unlike other rulers who claimed to be divine, Sargon portrayed himself not as a god, but as the chosen servant of the gods. In his inscriptions, Sargon often claimed that his military victories were granted by the gods, especially the god Enlil, the god of air and the supreme deity of the Sumerian pantheon. One of Sargon's most important acts was elevating his daughter, Enheduanna, to the position of high priestess of Nana, the moon god, in the city of Ur. Enheduanna wasn't just a symbol of divine favor. She was an intellectual force in her own right. As a poet and a priestess, she became one of the first known authors in history. Her hymns, which blended Sumerian religious traditions with loyalty to her father's rule, spread throughout the empire, reinforcing the link between the divine and the king's authority. By positioning his daughter in such a prominent role, Sargon ensured that both the religious and political aspects of his empire were intertwined, making his rule not just a matter of force, but a matter of divine mandate. The king's image was further reinforced through visual propaganda. Statues, seals, and carvings depicted Sargon standing tall, often in the presence of gods. His military triumphs were not just recorded, they were glorified, depicted as the will of the gods. Whether on a cylinder seal or on a temple wall, Sargon's image conveyed strength, divinity, and invincibility. His military conquests were presented not as acts of war, but as divine missions that brought order to the world. Despite his claims of divine favor, Sargon's rule was not without opposition. Rebellions were frequent, especially in the cities that had been forcibly brought into the empire. But Sargon's response to these revolts was swift and decisive. He did not just quash the uprisings, he destroyed the cities that dared to defy him. He reasserted control by punishing leaders, reinforcing garrisons, and reminding the people of Akkad's dominance. The empire was not just maintained by military might, it was enforced by fear, and the people knew that resistance had consequences. The fall of a giant. Sargon ruled for over 50 years, an extraordinary reign for a man who had started life as a servant. By the time of his death, his empire was vast, and his legacy was cemented. But as with all empires, the seeds of decline were already sown. After his death, his successors struggled to maintain the unity that Sargon had forged. Internal strife, rebellion, and external pressure began to take their toll. Sargon's grandsons, particularly Naram-Sin, faced new challenges. Naram-Sin, perhaps in an attempt to consolidate his power, declared himself a god, a title that no Mesopotamian king had ever claimed before. While this move may have been meant to strengthen his rule, it sparked unrest. Many believed that the gods had grown angry with Naram-Sin's hubris. When famine struck and invasions from the north began, rumors spread that the divine order had been broken. The Akkadian Empire, once unified under Sargon's strong leadership, began to unravel. Cities that had been absorbed into the empire began to rebel. The tribute system that Sargon had established began to break down as many regions refused to pay taxes. The Akkadians, a group of mountain peoples from the Zagros Mountains, took advantage of the empire's weakened state and invaded. The once great Akkadian Empire, which stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, began to collapse under the weight of internal conflict and external threats. Sargon's empire didn't fall in a single battle. It faded slowly as cities were abandoned, trade routes were disrupted, and the once unified state fractured. The empire that had claimed to rule all four corners of the earth was no more. But its legacy lived on. The idea of empire, of a single ruler controlling vast territories, would endure. And Sargon's story, though it ended in decline, would become the blueprint for every empire that followed. The fall of Akkad marked the end of an era, but the memory of Sargon and his empire would echo through history. His vision of a unified empire, ruled by a single king, set the stage for future empires. And his legacy lived on, not just in the records he left behind, but in the idea that an empire could be built, maintained, and sustained by more than just force. It could be built on vision, strategy, and the will of the people. Hammurabi and the Code of Power. The rise of Hammurabi, strategist king. Babylon, in the early 18th century, BCE, was one city among many. Larger than some, smaller than others, and still finding its place among powers like Larsa and Eshnunna. Hammurabi ascended the throne without an empire. What he inherited was potential and a tangled political landscape. His first moves were practical. He improved city defenses, repaired walls, and upgraded irrigation to support growing populations. Rather than charging headlong into conflict, he cultivated alliances, trading grain and copper to win favor among neighboring rulers. Then, when rivals faltered, whether through drought, rebellion, or political splits, Hammurabi advanced, integrating each city into Babylon's orbit through strategy instead of pure conquest. Over decades, these deliberate steps elevated Babylon into a networked realm with centralized authority at its core. By strategically waiting for the right moment, Hammurabi turned weakness into opportunity. He stepped in when Mari fractured under a coup, when Isin faced famine, and when Elamite incursions stretched military focus thin in the region. His campaigns were designed to unify rather than destroy. Conquered city-states retained local governors who paid tribute and followed Babylon's laws, while Hammurabi centralized power subtly but effectively. By leveraging bureaucracy and legal frameworks instead of armies alone, he created a resilient empire capable of maintaining cohesion over time. At his death, circa 1750 BCE, Babylon had grown into an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to northern Mesopotamia, not by sheer brute force, but through tactical governance and codified order. The code itself, justice etched in stone. Hammurabi's code was revolutionary in both scope and medium. Over 7 feet tall and carved into dark basalt, the stele stood in the temple court of Marduk for all to read. Its 282 laws covered daily life, from agricultural disputes and property ownership to family structures and professional responsibilities. For example, Law 117 required a builder to rebuild a house destroyed by their poor craftsmanship, at their own cost, to guarantee structural safety. Another law, 196, punished robbery with death, but mandated builders and physicians face liability for professional failures, demonstrating the code's balance of deterrence and accountability. This wasn't symbolic, it was intentional. The code's visibility signaled that Hammurabi's justice wasn't secretive or arbitrary. Citizens saw laws enforced openly. Officials posted copies in public spaces. Scribes copied them into provincial archives. By placing the laws in temple precincts, Hammurabi fused divine authority with civic order. The result was a legal framework that wielded power like a weapon, by having its force known, seen, and felt. Justice in action detailed case studies. In the temple piazza, a shepherd accused a neighbor of letting goats graze on his barley field. Under Law 24, livestock owners must pay compensation. The shepherd brings 6 goats into court as proof. Judges cite the law, measure the damage, and declare a 3-fold compensation. The neighbor agrees, goats are exchanged, and a scribe records the outcome on a clay tablet. This public justice reinforces order with ritual clarity and accountability. In the bustling market district, a caravan leader sues a trader who sold stolen silver. The crime falls under Law 22, requiring a sworn oath in temple court. The accused places his hand on a tablet and says, "By Shamash, I am innocent." The oath echoes with temple chants. If he's proven false later, execution follows. This isn't just a legal process, it's religious, moral, and communal. The oath deters lying and upholds public trust. Meanwhile, when a builder's wall collapses and kills a passerby, Law 229 applies. If a builder builds a house and it falls and kills its inhabitant, that builder shall be put to death. The court investigating examines the debris, questions witnesses, and pronounces the death penalty. The builder's craftsmen, a microcosm of workers witnessing justice, see the cost of negligence. In public, this engraves a lesson. Hold craftsmanship to the highest standards or face the consequences. Society under the code, roles, rights, and responsibilities. Hammurabi's society was layered yet structured for predictability. The Awilu, upper-class freemen, had the most protection. They could own land and serve as judges. The Mushkenu, commoners, also had legal standing. They married, owned property, and could sue. Even Wardu, slaves, were protected. They could appeal to courts and sometimes buy freedom. One law, 146, ensured a daughter had inheritance rights if no male heirs existed. This complex system maintained strict class distinctions, yet allowed defined rights, securing social stability across status lines. Gender roles were clearly drawn, but not wholly limiting. Women could file for divorce with valid cause, initiate legal processes, and own business assets. Notably, if a wife left her husband without cause, Law 141 allowed her return at his discretion, preserving marital norms while offering legal recourse. Widows often managed estates and inherited land. Children's custody could be contested in courts, and adoption was formalized under law. In short, Babylonian sexuality, family structure, and inheritance were regulated publicly, clarifying everyone's roles and expectations. Everyday Babylonian life: temples, trade, work. Babylon pulsed with activity under law's umbrella. Temples like Esagila and Iana were economic centers, managing estates, workshops, and grain stores. They practiced temple-based lending. Farmers borrowed seeds or animals during scarcity and repaid in harvest. When a borrower defaulted, temple courts enforced compliance. This partnership between religious institutions and legal system stabilized food distribution and reinforced temple authority. Trade relied on legal clarity. Caravan leaders carried merchant contracts notarized at temple courts. If a product was damaged en route, the law offered assured restitution. Standardized measures, shekels, minas, and volumes, ensured fairness. Traders from Dilmun, Magan, and the Levant navigated Babylon using these regulations, trusting the system's predictability. The economy grew in irrigated fields, branched roads, and distant markets. Work was divided precisely. Farmers labored under irrigation schedules set by temple overseers. Craftsmen followed guild-like regulations enforced by law. Bricklayers, copper workers, and potters were accountable. Mistakes triggered trials. Scribes held prized status. They read, inscribed, and archived legal and economic records. Even schoolchildren memorized the code, learning civic responsibility early. Labor, law, and ritual formed Babylon's daily structure. Legacy of the code: order enduring beyond empire. Hammurabi died, but his code lived on. His stele traveled beyond Babylon and became a template for future rulers. Kings of Assyria and later Babylon referred to him as a precedent. In faraway libraries, scribes copied segments of his laws. Centuries later, scholars would note similarities between his regulations and later legal systems, like Mosaic law, evidence of his enduring influence. Temples kept fragments as sacred texts. Courts remained modeled on his system. Even the idea of justice as public spectacle, open trials under religious guard, traveled. Hammurabi's concept of written law as binding for all classes laid foundations for Western jurisprudence. Without his code, law might have stayed oral or secret. Instead, he turned it into an institution, immutable, visible, and communal. In the quiet of the Louvre today, his stele stands as both relic and lesson. Thousands of years later, its inscriptions offer a window into how law shapes, reflects, and holds society together. Hammurabi didn't just rule with armies, he ruled with rules. He built an empire stronger than stone, etched into human conscience. That legacy endures still. Chaos and comebacks, Kassites, Hittites, and the Middle Period. The fall of Babylon. A sudden silence. The death of Hammurabi did not bring Babylon down right away, but the cracks formed early. His sons and grandsons continued to rule, still issuing decrees and collecting taxes, but the strength behind those commands faded. Without Hammurabi's strategic mind and hard authority, Babylon became increasingly fragile. Loyalty frayed at the edges, not with open rebellion at first, but with indifference and opportunism. Local governors looked to their own interests. Trade slowed, tribute waned. Babylon was no longer feared, it was being tolerated. Then came the moment no one expected. Around 1595 BCE, an army from Anatolia descended the Euphrates. The Hittites, led by King Mursili I, cut through northern Mesopotamia and struck Babylon in a single surgical raid. They didn't try to hold it. They didn't occupy the city or establish a new rule. They looted its temples, seized captives, and took back with them sacred statues, including the god Marduk himself. And just like that, the heart of Hammurabi's empire was pierced. But the damage wasn't only physical. The raid shattered Babylon's political image. The city that once claimed order now stood exposed. It had no clear successor, no heir who could rally the region. Its satellite cities began drifting, unsure whether to pledge loyalty or go independent. Diplomats stopped coming. Communications collapsed. In the wake of the Hittites, Babylon was less a kingdom and more a memory, one that could be respected, but no longer obeyed. What followed was not chaos in the streets, but confusion in the corridors. Temples tried to maintain order, but without state backing, many closed or limited their rituals. Merchants struggled to find safe routes. Regional rulers, once held in check by Babylon's name, began acting as kings in their own right. The cities of Mesopotamia had seen war before, but this felt different. It was not a single war. It was a spreading emptiness, and the silence would last for generations. The Kassite period, order in the ashes. From the mountains east of the Tigris came a people who had watched from a distance. The Kassites had no ancient capital, no written legacy, and no grand mythology to anchor them. But what they had was patience. For decades, they lived on the fringes of Mesopotamian politics, sometimes as mercenaries, sometimes as neighbors, and sometimes as servants in noble houses. But in the power vacuum left by Babylon's collapse, they saw a path not through conquest, but through restoration. The Kassite rise wasn't fast. It unfolded over nearly a century. By around 1475 BCE, they had taken control of Babylon and established a dynasty that would last for over 400 years, the longest continuous reign in Babylon's history. Yet their story remains poorly understood. Unlike the kings who came before, they didn't commission endless inscriptions of battle and victory. Instead, they focused on stability, bureaucracy, and quiet legitimacy. They ruled not by spectacle, but by structure. Rather than impose their own culture, the Kassites embraced the traditions already in place. They spoke Akkadian, followed the local gods, and respected Babylon's ancient laws. The Temple of Marduk, looted by the Hittites, was rebuilt and re-sanctified. Kassite kings called themselves governors as often as kings, understanding the power of appearing as caretakers rather than overlords. The population, wearied by decades of uncertainty, accepted them, not with celebration, but with relief. Kassite rule relied on a distributed system of governance. Provinces were managed by appointed officials, many of them from local noble families. The king granted land to allies in return for loyalty and service, building a network of political support without needing a vast standing army. Their capital, Dur-Kurigalzu, near modern Baghdad, was constructed as a ceremonial and administrative center. It featured ziggurats, palaces, and granaries, not for glory, but for functionality. Trade slowly resumed. With the Kassites came the widespread use of horses in war and transport. Babylon reconnected with Egypt, the Hittites, and even the distant Mycenaean Greeks. Clay tablets found in foreign capitals carried Akkadian writing, the diplomatic language of the era. The Kassites were not innovators, but they were integrators. They didn't just revive Babylon, they helped it re-enter the international stage. Not as an empire, but as a partner. Foreign flames, Hittites, Assyrians, and rivals. Even while Babylon found its footing under the Kassites, the world around it remained volatile. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire surged again under kings like Suppiluliuma I, whose ambition stretched toward the Levant and even clashed with Egyptian influence. The Hittites didn't attempt to reconquer Babylon, but they understood its value as a political ally or a strategic pawn. Letters exchanged between Babylonian kings and Hittite rulers reveal a language of flattery, warnings, and subtle threats. Diplomacy became a chessboard. To the north, Assyria was awakening. What had once been a minor kingdom was now expanding with methodical force. From their capital in Ashur, Assyrian kings began pushing southward, rebuilding their armies and administrative systems. They watched Babylon closely, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. The Kassites managed to keep Assyria at bay for a time by granting them respect in titles and avoiding provocation. But the balance was delicate, and the line between diplomacy and defiance was always thin. Further east, the Elamites remained a recurring threat. Based in the Zagros highlands, Elam was less concerned with alliances and more with plunder. Their raids into Mesopotamian territories came suddenly, targeting grain stores, temples, and border towns. Sometimes they were repelled, sometimes they weren't. Babylon never fully controlled Elam, and the memory of past conflicts remained close. The Kassites strengthened city walls and stored reserves, knowing that peace was a matter of luck as much as policy. Despite the instability, the Kassites avoided large-scale wars. Instead, they built relationships, sending daughters to foreign courts, exchanging gifts, and maintaining open trade routes. But they also knew the value of symbolic power. When Babylon was too weak to project force, it projected heritage. Its myths, its gods, and its language still carried weight across the Near East. And that cultural capital, more than military strength, held its place on the regional map. The Middle Period was a diplomatic era. States rose and fell, but Babylon kept its seat at the table. Not because it conquered, but because it mattered. The city was old, but still breathing. Its strength lay in its memory, its adaptability, and its name. It was no longer the judge of the region, but it remained its witness. Regional identities and the long wait. With no single power dominating Mesopotamia, local identities grew stronger. Each city reclaimed its traditions, its gods, and its priorities. While the Kassite kings maintained a central court, the true rhythms of life were shaped locally. In towns like Nippur, Sippar, and Isin, bureaucracy survived, but they were smaller, more focused on agriculture, temple management, and civic order. Cuneiform tablets from the time tell of grain quotas, land disputes, and temple offerings, not of empires or battles. Temples once again became the heart of urban life. Not just places of worship, but centers for education, storage, and justice. Priests acted as judges, teachers, and record keepers. The god Marduk was restored to his position in Babylon, while Enlil maintained prominence in Nippur. Each city had its divine patron, and religion filled the vacuum left by absent kings. It was the gods, not the rulers, who now watched over daily affairs. Education continued, but slowly. Scribes were still trained in the old ways. Students learned Sumerian proverbs, copied Akkadian legal texts, and memorized hymns. But innovation was rare. Few new genres emerged. Literature became preservationist, not creative. There was pride in the past, but little appetite for the future. The great breakthroughs of earlier centuries, law codes, dictionaries, astronomical records, were copied, not improved. Economically, the land adapted. Farms shifted with the river's moods. Merchants learned to navigate slower routes. Artisans focused on household goods rather than luxury. The international trade boom of earlier centuries shrank to a trickle, though it never fully disappeared. The economy wasn't dead, it was just smaller, grounded, local, and in its own way, resilient. This was not a golden age, but it was a necessary one. The Middle Babylonian period was not about triumph, it was about survival. It held the memory of earlier greatness and passed it on, quietly, carefully. And when the world around it began to fall again, Babylon was still there, waiting. Ashur rises, the Assyrian war machine. Forged by the north, the birth of Assyria. Long before Assyria conquered empires, it was just a name on a riverbank. The city of Ashur, named after its patron god, sat on a bend of the upper Tigris River, far from the fertile floodplains of southern Mesopotamia. Its land was harder, its weather less forgiving, and its neighbors more hostile. Unlike the abundance of Sumer, survival here meant struggle. That struggle hardened its people. The north lacked the open irrigation networks of the south. Farming was more dependent on rainfall and rugged terrace methods. Herding was common, and the frontier life bred a population used to risk. Towns were fortified early. Discipline, order, and military readiness weren't cultural values. They were the price of survival. In time, these habits would evolve into a system. Trade became Assyria's earliest connection to the wider world. Merchants traveled from Ashur to Anatolia, founding trade colonies like Kanesh. They exchanged tin, textiles, and silver. But wealth didn't mean complacency. Even the traders understood that a convoy needed guards. War and commerce moved together. The rulers of Ashur, although small in title, began to think in larger terms. They weren't kings of empire yet, but they were preparing. From the 20th to the 10th centuries BCE, Assyria's fortunes rose and fell. Kings expanded their territory in bursts, claiming border cities and building temples. But for long stretches, they were hemmed in by stronger neighbors. Babylon in the south, the Hittites in the northwest, the Mitanni and Hurrians to the north. What held Assyria together during these centuries was its consistency. The kings passed on a culture of obedience, harsh law, and calculated vengeance. This wasn't a land of great monuments yet, but it was a forge. And in that forge, a certain kind of state was being shaped. It didn't look like much to outsiders, but inside, something dangerous was growing. A belief that survival depended on power, and power depended on fear. The Iron System, expansion under Tiglath-Pileser III. By the 9th century BCE, the Kingdom of Assyria was back on the rise. Small victories turned into regional control, but real transformation came under one ruler, Tiglath-Pileser III, who seized power in 745 BCE. He didn't inherit a stable kingdom. He took control during a time of internal unrest. What made him different wasn't just military ambition, it was structure. He didn't want short-lived victories. He wanted something permanent. Tiglath-Pileser turned Assyria into a state with systems. He created the ancient world's first truly professional army. Soldiers were trained, salaried, equipped year-round, and rotated through garrisons and campaigns. No more seasonal militias or dependent allies. This force had engineers, cavalry, archers, and siege teams. Each unit had a role. Each soldier followed the chain of command. The empire he built grew fast. He marched west into Syria and south into Israel, capturing cities and imposing tribute. He didn't always annex territory. Sometimes he left local rulers in place, but turned them into vassals. In other cases, he reorganized the land into Assyrian provinces. These regions were ruled by appointed governors, who reported directly to the capital and were monitored by royal inspectors. One of his most controversial policies was mass deportation. When cities rebelled, he didn't just crush them. He relocated their populations across the empire. Families were torn from their homes and resettled in distant lands. This broke local identity and made organized resistance harder. But it also spread Assyrian culture, language, and administration further than ever before. Populations moved, but the system stayed in control. Roads were cleared, fortresses were rebuilt. Intelligence networks expanded. Messages from the capital could travel hundreds of miles in just days. Trade flowed through safe channels because rebellion was rare. Tiglath-Pileser didn't just want to conquer land, he wanted to mold it. And in doing so, he made Assyria something new, a fast, efficient, and brutal machine, held together by bureaucracy and fear. Cities of stone and blood, Sennacherib and the vision of Nineveh. The Assyrian state didn't just grow, it evolved, and in Sennacherib's reign, it turned toward spectacle. He came to the throne in 705 BCE and immediately faced rebellion in Babylon, Judea, and elsewhere. But Sennacherib wasn't just a general. He was an architect of domination, both physical and psychological. His vision centered on Nineveh. Though it had been an important city for centuries, Sennacherib made it the empire's beating heart. He expanded its walls, built aqueducts, redirected rivers, and raised palaces that dwarfed anything Assyria had seen before. Gardens were fed by stone channels. Courtyards were decorated with stone reliefs. And every inch of that stone told a message. Assyria cannot be challenged. but his ambition came with cruelty. In 701 BCE, Sennacherib led a famous campaign into Judah. Though he failed to take Jerusalem, he devastated the surrounding cities. The records show cities burned, populations deported, and tribute demanded. His inscriptions brag of stacking corpses, blinding enemies, and watching kings beg at his feet. Whether the numbers were exact or not, the message was intended. No resistance would go unanswered. His most infamous act came in 689 BCE, when Babylon, long the cultural rival of Assyria, rose in rebellion. Sennacherib destroyed the city completely. Temples were leveled, statues of gods were seized, walls were smashed. The act shocked even his own court. Babylon was sacred ground, and its destruction seemed to defy the gods. He declared that the city's divine protection had failed, and that Ashur now ruled in its place. But his brutality may have cost him. Years later, he was assassinated, most likely by his own sons. Babylon was eventually rebuilt by his successors, who tried to restore the balance he had broken. Still, Sennacherib left behind something unforgettable. Nineveh, his capital, stood as a vision of total control, calculated, ornamented, and unrelenting. It was beauty and horror written in stone. Ashurbanipal and the Final Surge. By the time Ashurbanipal took the throne in 669 BCE, Assyria had reached its greatest size. The empire stretched from the mountains of Iran to the Nile Delta. Its borders were wide, but under stress. Ashurbanipal, however, combined two traits few kings ever balanced: cruelty and intellect. He was a fierce general, conducting long and bloody campaigns against Elam and rebellious Babylon. Cities were burned, prisoners impaled, and statues of enemy kings dragged through the streets of Nineveh. His letters show a man obsessed with information, demanding daily reports from governors, punishing failure, and enforcing military discipline. But he wasn't just a warlord. He wanted knowledge, and he made sure it was preserved. Ashurbanipal founded what many call the first real library. In Nineveh, he collected texts from every corner of Mesopotamia. His scribes copied myths, laws, rituals, omens, and medical texts. Thousands of clay tablets were stored in labeled rooms. Some came from cities that no longer existed. Others recorded stories centuries old, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was an archive of civilization, built by a king who saw knowledge as power, but even he could not stop the storm that followed. After his death, internal rebellion tore the empire apart. The provinces revolted. Babylon asserted independence. In the east, the Medes grew stronger, and eventually, the Babylonians and Medes joined forces. By 612 BCE, they reached Nineveh. The siege was brutal, and when it ended, the city burned. Ashurbanipal's library was buried under rubble. His palaces were turned to ash. Assyria, the most feared empire the region had ever seen, vanished in a matter of years. There was no slow decline, no graceful fade. There was only collapse, but the words he preserved survived, dug up thousands of years later, and in those words, Assyria's voice still speaks. The machinery of fear, legacy, and lessons. Assyria didn't last forever, but for nearly 3 centuries, it defined what empire meant in the ancient world. Not just territory and armies, but systems, punishments, images, and memories. The Assyrians believed fear could be managed, weaponized, and turned into stability. For a time, they were right. They pioneered things now taken for granted in empire building. Standing armies, spy networks, mass deportation, standardized administration. They created a sense of central power that extended across thousands of miles. Their cities were both fortresses and theaters, designed to impress, intimidate, and control. Their kings weren't just men. They were symbols, living gods who ruled with divine right, divine cruelty, and divine silence. But in the end, the very tools they used became their weakness. Fear cannot be refreshed forever. Loyalty built on terror fades when the terror is no longer near. when Assyria stretched too far, demanded too much, and struck too often, its enemies remembered. And when the moment came, they struck back, with fire and vengeance. Yet Assyria's story doesn't end in ruins. Its models were studied by later empires, Babylon, Persia, even Rome. Its images of kingship survived, its records, so meticulously preserved, gave modern scholars their clearest picture of the ancient world. And its memory of order and violence, of control and collapse, remains one of the most powerful in all of history. Ashur rose, it ruled, it punished, it organized. It left scars across continents. But in the ruins of Nineveh and the lines of cuneiform still being read today, we see not just what Assyria destroyed, but what it built, and what it believed. That power, once forged, must be sharpened again and again, until the hand that holds it is no longer steady. Fall of Nineveh, the end of Assyria, the strain of an empire. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, a colossal entity spanning from the borders of Egypt to the Zagros Mountains, had been the dominant power in the ancient world for nearly 2 centuries. Under its kings, it had crushed cities, uprooted populations, and spread fear from the Fertile Crescent to the distant lands of Anatolia. But as the years passed, the very systems that had held this empire together began to show signs of decay. The might of Assyria, once unrivaled, was beginning to crack. The empire's vast reach required constant oversight. The Assyrian kings had built their power on military dominance, but maintaining control over such a vast area proved to be an immense challenge. The empire had been constructed around the need for speed and precision. Roads were constantly patrolled, governors monitored, and taxes collected. The sheer scale of the bureaucracy required constant vigilance, and the vast distances between the Assyrian heartland and its far-flung provinces made communication slow. Though the kings had once been able to command and conquer swiftly, their grasp on distant territories was becoming increasingly tenuous. Internal strain began to become just as dangerous as external threats. The empire's elite, the generals, the priests, and the governors, began to fracture under the mounting pressure. A once tightly knit ruling class began to splinter as ambitions grew. Some generals, once loyal to the king, began to see themselves as powerful leaders in their own right. Others began questioning the direction in which the empire was heading. The royal court, which had once been the center of power, began to lose its stability. After the death of Ashurbanipal in 627 BCE, a king who had ruled with an iron fist, the Assyrian system began to lose its coherence. The dynastic line of succession became uncertain. Brothers turned on brothers, rival claimants fought for power, and cities began to burn as the unity of the empire fractured from within. The Assyrian military, once a tool of unrivaled terror, had begun to backfire. The policy of mass deportations, which had once effectively broken the spirit of conquered peoples, had created lasting resentment. Whole populations had been forced to leave their homelands and resettle in foreign territories. Over time, these people began to hold grudges, and with every new generation, the desire for rebellion grew. The fear that had once kept the empire together, fear of the Assyrian military machine, began to lose its potency. Assyria's strength was no longer enough to keep its far-flung provinces under control. The empire was still running, but it had lost the ability to control the momentum. It had become a machine of war, yet the hands guiding it were weak. While the Assyrian Empire fought to hold on to its power, its enemies waited in the wings, biding their time. Some merely observed as the cracks appeared, while others, more ambitious, began to act. The Assyrians, who had once been the greatest military power in the world, now found themselves vulnerable. The world they had dominated for so long was slowly starting to change. The iron wall that had once protected them was showing signs of rust. The seeds of rebellion, Babylon and the Medes. To the south, the city of Babylon, Assyria's eternal rival, had not forgotten the humiliation it had suffered under Sennacherib's siege over a century earlier. Babylon, once the most powerful city in Mesopotamia, had been ravaged and occupied, its people scattered, its temples destroyed, and its glory dimmed. But even though the city had been forced into submission, its identity remained. Babylon was more than just a city, it was a symbol of the old world. Over the years, Babylon had slowly begun to regain its strength. Its people, led by the Chaldean warlord Nabopolassar, were ready to rise once more. Around 626 BCE, Nabopolassar declared himself king of Babylon and began to challenge Assyrian dominance. His rise marked a critical moment in the history of the empire. He understood that Babylon could not stand alone against the might of Assyria. Thus, he sought out allies to support his cause. The Medes, a nomadic people who lived to the east of Mesopotamia, had suffered under the Assyrians' brutal policies. The Medes had lost entire cities, and their populations had been forced into exile. But like Babylon, they had a strong sense of identity, and the time had come for them to reclaim their lands. The Medes, under the leadership of King Cyaxares, had unified their fractured tribes. With Cyaxares at the helm, the Medes quickly became a powerful force. Their military strength, bolstered by cavalry and a deep hatred of the Assyrians, was formidable. The Babylonians and Medes, driven by their shared grievances against Assyria, formed an alliance that would ultimately spell the beginning of the end for the Assyrian Empire. Initially, the campaigns against Assyria were cautious. The Babylonian and Median forces tested Assyria's defenses, capturing border towns and securing vital supply lines. With each victory, their confidence grew, and the once invincible Assyrian garrisons began to fall. Rebellions flared in the wake of their successes. The seeds of discontent that had been sown throughout the empire for generations began to take root. The Assyrian military, once an unstoppable force, found itself stretched thin. The enemy no longer feared the Assyrian might. It had become the conqueror, tearing apart the empire piece by piece. By 614 BCE, the Medes and Babylonians reached the Assyrian heartland and captured Ashur, the spiritual and cultural center of the empire. The city fell swiftly, and the Assyrian gods, symbols of the empire's divine legitimacy, were desecrated and left in ruins. The message was clear. Assyria's reign of terror was over. The fear that had once preserved the empire had turned inward. Its foundations, once so strong, had crumbled. The greatest symbol of Assyrian power, the city of Nineveh, was next. The fall of Nineveh, a siege of silence. Nineveh was not just a capital, it was the beating heart of the Assyrian Empire. The city was a massive fortress, with walls that stretched for miles and palaces filled with artwork commemorating Assyria's military triumphs. The city had been designed to last, a monument to the power and glory of Assyria. But in 612 BCE, Nineveh, the city that had stood as a symbol of Assyrian might, was under siege. The siege of Nineveh was a culmination of years of pressure. The alliance between the Babylonians and the Medes had completely encircled the city. The Assyrians, despite their advanced defenses, double walls, fortified gates, and a network of canals, could not hold out forever. The attackers, now bolstered by years of anger and resentment, had come for revenge. They had seen their cities destroyed and their people humiliated. They had nothing left to lose. For 3 months, the Babylonian and Median forces battered Nineveh's walls. They built ramps to scale the fortifications. They cut off the city's water supply, and they blocked any potential escape routes. The Assyrians fought back, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. As the days dragged on, the city's morale began to falter. Inside the walls of Nineveh, there was fear. Outside, there was determination. The once proud city was now a trap, its inhabitants slowly realizing that they had no hope left. The end came with an unexpected force: floodwaters. Accounts of the event suggest that a great flood, perhaps naturally occurring or perhaps deliberately caused, breached part of Nineveh's defenses, allowing the enemy to pour in. The battle shifted from the walls to the streets. then to the palaces and temples. The Assyrians, who had once been the masters of destruction, now found themselves facing the same fate they had inflicted upon so many others. The city was razed to the ground, and Nineveh, the heart of Assyria, was lost. When the smoke cleared, Nineveh's once mighty walls were nothing more than rubble. The royal archives, which contained the histories and records of the empire, were buried in the ruins. For the first time in centuries, the Assyrian kings had no words to offer. No messages, no orders, no commands. Only silence. The empire that had ruled with terror and precision for so long had fallen, and with it, a way of life that had lasted for over a millennium. Aftermath and echoes in prophecy. The fall of Nineveh sent shockwaves across the ancient world. The Assyrian Empire, once feared and respected, had vanished in a matter of months. Cities that had once trembled before the Assyrian war machine now watched the smoke rise in the distance. Refugees flooded out of the city, some seeking refuge with the Babylonians, others fleeing into the hills. The loss of Nineveh marked the end of Assyria's dominance. The world that had once been shaped by Assyria's military power was now being reshaped by new forces. Babylon reclaimed its independence, and under Nabopolassar's leadership, the city once again rose to prominence. The Medes carved out new territories in the north, while Egypt, though weakened, began to reassert itself in the west. The Assyrian Empire's fall created a power vacuum, and the ancient world was soon filled with new players vying for control. The destruction of Assyria wasn't just a political shift, it was a cultural break. For centuries, Assyria had shaped the language, religion, and architecture of the Near East. Its fall opened the door for new powers to rise, but the memory of Assyria would linger for generations. Among the Hebrew prophets, the fall of Nineveh was seen not just as a historical event, but as divine judgment. The prophet Nahum, who had written about the impending fall of the city, described it with chilling accuracy. Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims. Jonah's story, too, had predicted Nineveh's downfall. But unlike Nahum's prophecy, Jonah's tale offered a chance for redemption. Nineveh, in Jonah's eyes, had been given a chance to repent, but by the time of its fall, no such chance was offered. The gods had spoken. The silence was complete. In the centuries that followed, Assyria's legacy lived on. Not in its power, but in the lessons it left behind. The ruins of Nineveh would be rediscovered, its story retold. Assyria had ruled through fear, but in the end, it was the passage of time, the erosion of loyalty, and the loss of unity that led to its demise. The empire's name would echo in history, but its walls would stand silent. Babylon returns, Nebuchadnezzar and the new empire, the fall of Assyria and the rise of Babylon. In 612 BCE, the fall of Nineveh marked a watershed moment for the ancient world. The Assyrian Empire, once the most fearsome military power to ever stretch, from the Mediterranean Sea to the Zagros Mountains, came crashing down. Its mighty army was crushed, its capital reduced to ruins, and its kings were scattered to the winds. This monumental collapse reshaped the entire geopolitical landscape of the Near East. As Assyria crumbled, the power vacuum it left behind beckoned to the ancient cities that had once been its rivals. Babylon, which had been a broken shadow of its former self after centuries of humiliation at the hands of Assyrian kings, now stood poised to rise once more. A city that had once been a symbol of grandeur. Its ziggurats towering over the plains and its temples echoing with the sounds of worship, was given a second chance. Under Nabopolassar, the city had made strides toward reclaiming its autonomy. The Chaldean king had been a driving force behind the defeat of Assyria, and with the fall of Nineveh, Babylon's future appeared to open up before it. But it was Nebuchadnezzar II, Nabopolassar's son, who would take this opportunity to transform Babylon from a mere survivor of conquest into the greatest city in the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar inherited a city that had long been ravaged by war, But he didn't just seek to restore Babylon to its former glory. His vision was far grander. He sought to build an empire, one that would outshine all others, not just militarily, but culturally and architecturally as well. His empire was not simply built on conquest. It was built on the idea of a city as both a physical and spiritual monument, a military campaign to secure the throne. Nebuchadnezzar II came to power in 605 BCE, following the death of his father, Nabopolassar. But his rise was not without its challenges. In his early years, he faced military threats from Egypt and the remnants of the Assyrian forces. His most famous campaign occurred at the Battle of Carchemish, where Nebuchadnezzar decisively defeated the Egyptian army. This victory didn't just solidify his control over Babylon, it sent a clear message to the world. The Babylonians were once again a force to be reckoned with. But Nebuchadnezzar's ambition didn't stop at the battlefield. Though his military victories were impressive, he understood that true power didn't only come from defeating enemies, it came from what you built afterward. Babylon needed more than just military conquest. It needed restoration, reinvention, and a forward-looking vision that would elevate the city far above the ruins of its past. Nebuchadnezzar's aim was not simply to restore Babylon to its former stature, but to make it the cultural and spiritual heart of the ancient world. A vision of grandeur, the rebuilding of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar poured his wealth and energy into transforming Babylon into a city like no other. Unlike earlier kings, who had only focused on military glory, Nebuchadnezzar sought to make his capital a place of awe, a symbol of divine favor and earthly might. The city's infrastructure was in dire need of repair. Babylon's ancient walls had fallen into disrepair, its temples damaged, and its roads and canals worn down from years of neglect. Nebuchadnezzar set to work with a single vision: to make Babylon the center of the known world, a city whose splendor would transcend all others. The walls of Babylon were expanded and reinforced. These walls were not mere fortifications. They were symbols of Nebuchadnezzar's unyielding power. The massive Ishtar Gate, one of the most iconic monuments of the ancient world, was reconstructed with brilliant blue-glazed bricks, adorned with images of lions, dragons, and gods. The processional way, a ceremonial avenue, was built to connect the Ishtar Gate to the city's heart, lined with reliefs depicting the king's victories and the gods' blessings. At the heart of Nebuchadnezzar's rebuilding efforts was the restoration of the Etemenanke ziggurat, a monumental structure dedicated to Marduk, the god of Babylon. The ziggurat was an architectural marvel, a towering temple complex that may have inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. Its massive stepped platform stretched high into the sky, symbolizing both Babylon's divine favor and its earthly aspirations. This ziggurat, along with Nebuchadnezzar's other monumental projects, was designed not just for worship, but for ensuring that the king's power was imprinted on the land itself, solidifying his reign for generations to come. Beyond the physical structures, Nebuchadnezzar also sought to restore the city's prosperity. Canals were dug, trade routes were revived, and agricultural systems were restructured. Babylon, once a city ravaged by war, was now becoming a thriving hub of commerce, culture, and divine legitimacy. Nebuchadnezzar poured resources into every facet of Babylon's economy. Agriculture, trade, and industry flourished under his rule. Babylon became a center of innovation, a beacon of civilization and stability in a tumultuous region. The Hanging Gardens, the vision of a green oasis. Among Nebuchadnezzar's many architectural feats, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon remain one of the most legendary and mysterious of them all. Described by Greek historians such as Strabo and Philo, the gardens were said to rise in lush terraces above the city, with cascading waterfalls, exotic trees, and flowering plants. The gardens were purported to be an oasis in the desert, an engineering marvel that brought nature into the heart of the city. But whether they truly existed or not remains a matter of debate. Some historians suggest that the gardens were created by Nebuchadnezzar for his queen, Amatis, who longed for the green hills and mountains of her homeland. Others believe that the gardens may have been built by the Assyrians, possibly in Nineveh, and later attributed to Nebuchadnezzar. Archaeological evidence has failed to definitively prove the existence of the Hanging Gardens, as no ruins have been found in Babylon that correspond to the descriptions. Yet, regardless of whether the gardens were real, their symbolic importance is undeniable. The idea of a green oasis, created through human ingenuity in the midst of a harsh desert landscape, embodied the very spirit of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. The gardens, real or imagined, represented the king's ambition to make Babylon not only powerful, but beautiful, a city of luxury, nature, and engineering that would captivate the imagination of all who saw it. In a region defined by war and conquest, Nebuchadnezzar's vision of a city built on beauty and order stood as a stark contrast, offering a glimpse of what was possible when the gods and men worked together to shape the world. The Babylonian exile, captives in a foreign land. While Nebuchadnezzar's reign was marked by grandeur and ambition, it also left a profound mark on the history of the Jewish people. During his campaigns, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem twice, in 597 BCE and again in 586 BCE. On the second siege, he destroyed the city's great temple and deported a large number of its inhabitants to Babylon. This event, known as the Babylonian captivity, would have a lasting impact on the Jewish people. Thousands of Jewish captives, priests, scribes, craftsmen, and nobles, were brought to Babylon. They were not slaves in chains, but displaced people living in a foreign land, with limited freedom but the opportunity to build new lives. Some of the exiles prospered, finding work as artisans, merchants, and administrators. Others clung to their faith and traditions, maintaining their identity and culture in a foreign city. The canals and marketplaces of Babylon became a strange new home for these exiles, a place where they would find both survival and sorrow. The Babylonian captivity became a defining moment in Jewish history, one that would shape the faith and identity of the Jewish people for centuries to come. During this time, some of the most profound writings in the Hebrew Bible were composed. The Psalms of Lament, the prophetic visions, and the stories of the Book of Daniel all emerged during or after the exile. The figure of Daniel, who served in Nebuchadnezzar's court, became a symbol of faith and survival as he navigated the political and religious tensions of the Babylonian Empire. In the Book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar is depicted as a proud king, brought low by divine judgment, only to be restored once he acknowledges the supremacy of the gods. The story of the fiery furnace, the dream of the great statue, and the mysterious writing on the wall all revolve around Nebuchadnezzar's pride, his fall, and his eventual redemption. For the Jewish exiles, Nebuchadnezzar was both a villain and an instrument of God's will, a king who represented the power of empire, but also a ruler who provided the backdrop for spiritual reflection, transformation, and hope. The legacy of Nebuchadnezzar II, the end of an era. Nebuchadnezzar II ruled for over 40 years, transforming Babylon into the epicenter of the ancient world. Under his leadership, the city reached heights of prosperity, culture, and military power that would not be seen again for centuries. Nebuchadnezzar built a city that became a legend. His military campaigns ensured Babylon's dominance, while his architectural projects turned the city into a symbol of divine favor and human achievement. The grandeur of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar's reign was unmatched, and its legacy would echo through the ages. Yet, as with all empires, the seeds of decline were sown. Nebuchadnezzar's successors lacked the strength and vision of their great king. The empire began to unravel. Factional struggles emerged. Control over distant territories weakened. And as new powers rose in the east and west, Babylon's dominance began to fade. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BCE, but his empire would not last much longer. In the years after his death, Babylon faced increasing pressure from external threats, internal instability, and economic decline. The great city that had once been the center of the world would soon find itself facing a new generation of conquerors, ones who would not conquer with fire and sword, but through the quiet power of patience and persistence. But that, as they say, is another story. In the end, Nebuchadnezzar's reign stands as one of the most remarkable in ancient history. His achievements in architecture, military conquest, and governance set a standard that would influence empires for centuries. His legacy is felt not only in the monuments he left behind, but in the lasting memory of a king who built a city that seemed destined to outlive the very gods themselves. Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar, was not just a city. It was a symbol of human ambition, divine favor, and eternal power. Cyrus the Great and the fall of Babylon, a silent storm, the Persian advance. By 539 BCE, Babylon stood as a mighty city, but one weakened by internal divisions and external pressures. Nabonidus, the reigning king of Babylon, had spent a considerable amount of time away from the city, devoting himself to religious matters in the Arabian desert, leaving his son Belshazzar to govern in his stead. This absence sowed discontent, particularly among Babylon's religious elite, who resented Nabonidus' neglect of Babylon's traditional gods in favor of the moon god Sin. While Belshazzar held power, his rule lacked both the respect of the military and the religious leaders, creating a volatile political situation. Meanwhile, to the east, Cyrus the Great had forged a new power out of the ancient lands of Persia and Media. He had already proven himself a formidable ruler by uniting the Persians and Medes, laying the groundwork for the first true Persian Empire. His reputation for being both a military genius and a ruler who respected the customs of those he conquered made him a respected figure across the ancient world. To the surrounding kingdoms, however, this respect was a source of unease. Cyrus's ambitions were clear. He was not content with merely controlling Persia. He wanted more. And Babylon, still a symbol of power in the ancient world, stood as his next great prize. Cyrus's forces began their march toward Babylon in 539 BCE. Before he could even begin his military campaign in earnest, the Persians had already made a decisive move. They crushed the Babylonian forces near the town of Opis, situated along the Tigris River. This battle, which took place in late September 539 BCE, would prove to be a turning point in the struggle for the region. The Persians shattered the Babylonian army, and this defeat sent shockwaves through the city-state's defenses. From that point forward, Babylon's fate was sealed, and its collapse became inevitable. The conquest of Babylon did not happen overnight. While the battle at Opis was decisive, the political landscape of Babylon had already begun to crumble behind the scenes. A weakening of leadership, coupled with internal unrest, left the city vulnerable to invasion. As Babylon's king, Nabonidus, fled to Sippar, a nearby city, his absence left the gates of Babylon unprotected and its defenses falling apart. With the military and political elite in disarray, the city's fate rested on the shoulders of an unprepared and divided defense. And then came the decisive moment, the river trick entering Babylon. Cyrus's strategy for entering Babylon was nothing short of brilliant. The city, with its towering walls and great fortifications, seemed impregnable. Yet Cyrus, ever the tactician, knew that he needed more than just military might. He needed a strategy that would leave his enemies unprepared and in shock. At the heart of this strategy was a remarkable act of engineering. Cyrus had his engineers divert the Euphrates River, which flowed through Babylon. The plan was to create a canal that would lower the river's level, exposing the hidden gates beneath the city's defenses. As the waters of the Euphrates receded, the Persians found their moment. The riverbed, once a natural barrier and a source of life for the city, became a secret path into Babylon. In October 539 BCE, during the celebrations of the major Babylonian religious festival, when the city's streets were full of drunken revelry, Cyrus's soldiers moved swiftly under the cover of darkness. They marched into the city without resistance, slipping through the newly exposed gates as the Babylonians slept, unaware that their world was about to change forever. The festival timing was no coincidence. It provided the perfect opportunity for a surprise attack. The Babylonians were caught off guard as their soldiers and guards, celebrating the festival and indulging in wine and revelry, were not prepared for a sudden military strike. The festivities created a perfect cover for Cyrus's army to enter the city unnoticed. As the Persians quietly infiltrated Babylon, the residents were none the wiser, completely unaware that their city was under siege until it was too late. This act of strategic brilliance marked the beginning of the end for the once powerful city. The Persians quickly captured key positions, including the gates, royal precincts, and important temples. The city fell into a state of shock and disarray, with little resistance offered by the defenders. Nabonidus, who had fled to Sippar in fear, quickly surrendered when he returned to find Babylon in the hands of the Persians. His power and the power of Babylon had crumbled in a night. The cylinder and the affirmation of mercy. With Babylon in his grasp, Cyrus moved to solidify his control over the city. He understood the importance of restoring order, not through violence, but through diplomacy and respect for the local customs. The Persian king issued what would later be known as the Cyrus Cylinder, a document that proclaimed his intentions toward Babylon and its people. Inscribed in Akkadian, the cylinder declared that Cyrus was the chosen of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. He emphasized that his conquest was not one of destruction, but one of restoration. The cylinder recorded Cyrus's commitment to returning the statues of the gods that had been taken by Nabonidus and restoring the religious practices that had been neglected during his reign. His promise of religious tolerance and his respect for local customs were part of a broader political strategy to win the loyalty of the Babylonians. Cyrus did not want to simply conquer Babylon. He wanted to integrate it into his empire peacefully and with the blessing of its gods. By positioning himself as the divine choice to rule Babylon, Cyrus was able to secure the cooperation of the Babylonians. He recognized the importance of religion to the people of the city, and he took great pains to portray himself as a ruler who would preserve their religious practices rather than destroy them. The inclusion of the gods in the narrative of his conquest was a deliberate move. He wasn't just claiming victory over Babylon. He was presenting himself as the god-appointed ruler, thus reinforcing his divine right to rule over the region. This shift from the violent conquest of the Assyrians to a more strategic and diplomatic approach was a hallmark of Cyrus's reign. By placing importance on mercy, respect, and religious tolerance, he was able to integrate Babylon into his growing empire without resorting to the usual methods of brute force. This approach would set the tone for his reign and for the policies of the Persian Empire as a whole. Legacy, exiles, and the new era. Cyrus's rule over Babylon marked a turning point not just for the city, but for the entire ancient world. In the aftermath of his conquest, Babylon became an important part of the Persian Empire, though it would never again hold the same level of prominence it once had. Yet, Cyrus's policies ensured that Babylon remained an influential cultural and administrative center. One of the key aspects of Cyrus's reign was his policy toward the displaced peoples he encountered during his campaigns. Rather than forcing them into servitude or continuing the brutal practices of his predecessors, he reversed the forced migrations that had been imposed by earlier rulers. He allowed the exiled peoples of Babylonia, especially the Jewish people who had been taken from their homeland by the Babylonians, to return to their cities and temples. This act of mercy was not merely a political maneuver, it was a calculated gesture of stability. By allowing the displaced populations to return to their homelands, Cyrus sought to prevent future rebellions and secure the loyalty of these people. They would not only be grateful to him for restoring their homes and religious practices, but they would also become loyal subjects of the Persian Empire, bolstering his rule with their support. For these displaced peoples, the return to their homeland marked a momentous event. It signified the end of years of exile and the beginning of a new chapter in their history. The restoration of their homes, their temples, and their traditions under Persian rule was a gesture that would echo through the centuries, influencing the course of their cultural and religious identity. The restoration of Babylon's temple system and the return of exiled populations helped to stabilize the region. Babylon's economy quickly rebounded under Persian rule, as trade flourished and markets filled with goods from across the empire. With Persian respect for local customs and the administrative expertise of Babylon's bureaucrats, the city once again became a thriving center of culture and commerce. The transformation of Babylon under Cyrus. Under Cyrus's reign, Babylon transitioned from a symbol of imperial conquest to a respected member of the Persian Empire. The city's role shifted from an imperial capital to a cultural cornerstone. While it retained its importance, it no longer held the position of dominance it once had. The Persian model of governance, based on respect for local traditions and decentralized administration, allowed Babylon to flourish within the empire, albeit as a lesser power. Cyrus's legacy, however, was not just one of military conquest and territorial expansion. It was the creation of an empire that integrated diverse peoples, languages, and cultures. His reign marked the end of the old imperial models based on fear and brutality, and the beginning of a new approach to empire building, one based on respect, negotiation, and cooperation. Though the Persian Empire would eventually face challenges, including revolts and external threats, the foundation Cyrus laid endured. His vision of governance, where empires were built on shared interests rather than the fear of punishment, was a model that influenced the course of history. While Babylon's grandeur would never fade entirely, its days of dominating the ancient Near East came to an end. The Persians, under Cyrus and his successors, continued to expand their empire, eventually stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the Indus River. Babylon's role in the broader world would now be one of cultural significance, rather than political dominance. The fall of Babylon did not come with the same dramatic destruction that had marked the end of previous empires. Instead, it was a gradual shift in power, one where the city's significance as a military and political center was replaced by its cultural and economic importance within the Persian framework. Babylon had been conquered, but in many ways it had been transformed into a model of integration, tolerance, and governance. Lost and found, the rediscovery of Mesopotamia. Ghost cities beneath the sand. For nearly 2,000 years, Mesopotamia lay silent beneath layers of dust, myth, and empire. Its cities had been abandoned, its languages forgotten. Even its gods, once feared and praised, were erased from memory. What remained were ruins. Vast mounds scattered across modern Iraq and Syria, brushed by desert winds and tribal legends. Locals called them tells, thinking they were nothing more than natural hills. But those mounds held stories, stone fragments, temple foundations, tablets made of clay. Beneath the dirt were cities like Nineveh, Babylon, and Ur, once centers of the ancient world. To European travelers of the 18th and 19th centuries, these lands were unknown, disconnected from the biblical and classical worldviews they studied. Most believed civilization began with Egypt or Greece. Mesopotamia was a blank spot, mysterious, ignored, unexplored. That began to change in the early 1800s. British officers and travelers, drawn by curiosity and colonial ambitions, entered the region under Ottoman rule. Some were treasure hunters, others were scholars, but what they uncovered reshaped history forever. The land between two rivers was not just a backdrop to ancient texts, it was the stage where civilization first stood, and so began the race, not for gold, but for knowledge. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia didn't come with armies or empires, but with picks, notebooks, and careful hands. The men who cracked the code. In the mid-19th century, two names emerged as key to unraveling the mystery: Sir Austen Henry Layard and Henry Rawlinson. Layard, a young British adventurer with no formal archaeological training, began digging at the site of Nimrud in the 1840s. What he uncovered stunned Europe. Palaces of Assyrian kings, colossal statues, and carved stone panels filled with winged creatures and detailed battles. Then came Nineveh. Then came the library of Ashurbanipal. Thousands of cuneiform tablets, intact, legible, and dry, had survived millennia underground. Meanwhile, Rawlinson worked not in the earth, but in the cliffs. At Behistun, in modern-day Iran, he studied a towering multilingual inscription carved into rock. Created by King Darius of Persia, the Behistun inscription held 3 languages, including Old Persian and 2 forms of cuneiform. It was the Rosetta Stone of Mesopotamia. Rawlinson climbed the cliff face, copied the inscriptions, and slowly began to decode the lost language of ancient scribes. By the 1850s, cuneiform was no longer a mystery. Clay tablets, once thought meaningless, now told stories, listed laws, described eclipses, and recorded trade. Scholars identified names like Sargon, Hammurabi, and Gilgamesh, not as legends, but as rulers of real cities. The mythical East was transforming into a documented civilization with names, dates, and borders. The impact was seismic. These discoveries pushed back the known history of writing and kingship by over 1,000 years. Egypt and Greece were no longer alone. Mesopotamia stood as the oldest voice of urban humanity. Law, myth, and memory. The tablets brought to light more than records. They revealed the world's first law codes, including the famous Code of Hammurabi, inscribed centuries before Moses, outlining social order, justice, and punishment. There were business contracts, court proceedings, and receipts for grain. In one moment, a kingdom felt mythical. In the next, it felt familiar, bureaucratic, structured, and entirely human. Other texts reached deeper. Myths emerged. Cosmic battles, divine councils, and creation stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh, recovered from Nineveh, gave the world its earliest surviving work of literature. It told of a king's search for immortality, his friendship with a wild man, and a flood sent by the gods. The echoes were unmistakable. It didn't just predate the Hebrew Bible. It paralleled themes found in cultures across the Near East. These texts didn't just tell us who they were. They told us something about who we are. Ideas about kingship, justice, the afterlife, and the role of the divine began here, in palaces, temples, and scribal schools of Sumer and Akkad. Even the way we divide time into 60 seconds and 60 minutes traces back to Mesopotamian math. The zodiac, astrology, and calendars all owed debts to Babylonian skywatchers. Their influence seeped into Western legal traditions, scientific thinking, and mythological frameworks. Without Mesopotamia, much of what we call Western civilization would be missing its roots: Iraq, identity, and the weight of legacy. Today, Mesopotamia lives not only in museums and books. It lives in the soil of modern Iraq. The cities of Baghdad, Mosul, and Hilla rest on the bones of Babylon, Nineveh, and Ur. Archaeologists, Iraqi and international alike, have continued excavations through war, political upheaval, and natural erosion. Every spade in the ground offers a new sentence in the story. But it's not without conflict. Political instability, looting, and war have threatened many sites. The 2003 Iraq War saw museums looted and dig sites damaged. The rise of ISIS brought additional destruction. Entire statues were smashed. Ancient libraries were burned again, this time not by accident, but by ideology. Still, efforts to preserve continue. Scholars, archivists, and Iraqi heritage workers have restored artifacts, digitized texts, and rebuilt museum collections. New generations of Iraqis are studying the past as a way to reclaim identity, pride, and sovereignty. The ruins are no longer silent. They are teaching tools, cultural anchors, and political statements. To some, Mesopotamia is history. To Iraq, it's home. The connection between people and land has not been lost. It's been rediscovered. Closing narration. Outro bridge. For centuries, Mesopotamia was forgotten. Its kings, its stories, its people buried beneath mud and myth. But now, thanks to curiosity, courage, and patience, we can walk through its palaces. We can read the thoughts of its scribes. We can see how their dreams shaped ours. They built the world's first cities. They wrote the world's first laws. And when they fell, they left behind something greater than monuments. They left a memory. And now, we finally learned how to listen.